A stern voice cut through the murmurs at the gate. "Ma'am, please step aside." All eyes turned to the source of the commotion. Near the boarding gate of Delta Flight 219, an elderly woman stood small and frail before a uniformed security officer. The woman's gnarled fingers gripped her boarding pass as if it were a lifeline. Her heart pounded in her chest, confusion and embarrassment washing over her. Passengers in the waiting area craned their necks to see what was happening. Some exchanged exasperated glances, irritated that their departure was being held up. A businessman in a pressed suit sighed loudly, checking his watch. An impatient mother hushed her fussy child, shooting a withering look toward the delay. The elderly woman felt each stare like a weight on her shoulders. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The security officer held up an object, a small silver medal attached to a faded ribbon. "This was in your carry-on, ma'am," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The old woman's eyes widened. It was her service medal from decades ago, one she had carried for luck. She hadn't meant to cause trouble. I forgot it was there," she stammered softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Shame and anxiety crept into her face as she watched the officer inspect the medal under the fluorescent lights. He turned it over and read the engraved words quietly, then looked back at her in surprise. But the other passengers only saw a holdup. Someone muttered, "We're going to miss our connections because of this." The woman's cheeks burned. She wanted to disappear. None of them knew what that medal truly meant, what she had done to earn it. In that moment, she was just a troublesome old lady in their eyes. The officer's radio crackled. After a pause, he handed back the medal gently along with her bag. "All right, you're clear," he said, a touch of respect now in his tone. Relief mingled with lingering humiliation as the woman clutched her medal to her chest and bowed her head in thanks. She was free to board at last. But as she shuffled toward the jet bridge, a new voice rang out behind them, firm and authoritative. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" The elderly woman froze. That voice, it carried the kind of authority she hadn't heard in years. The security officer straightened reflexively. Passengers fell silent, sensing a shift in the air. She turned slowly and her tired eyes met the piercing gaze of a tall man in a crisp military dress uniform. He had arrived at the gate unnoticed in the commotion, and now he stepped forward, looking directly at her. She didn't recognize him, but the way he looked at her felt strangely familiar. None of the bystanders could have guessed that this last unassuming passenger was about to receive an honor decades overdue. They had no idea who she truly was. In the next few moments, their impatience would turn to astonishment and admiration, all because of a single salute. If you believe respect should be given to those who quietly earned it, then join us by subscribing. That morning, Margaret Bradley awoke before dawn with a familiar knot of anticipation in her stomach. At 77 years old, even simple travels required courage, though not the kind she once needed in the cockpit of a fighter jet. The humid Florida air clung to her as she donned her neatest slacks and a pale blue blouse. For a moment, her hand hovered over the old uniform hanging at the back of her closet, the Air Force dress blues she hadn't worn in decades. She traced a finger over the faint outline where her pilot's wings used to be pinned. A wave of pride mixed with sadness washed over her, but she gently closed the closet. Today, she would travel as just another passenger, not as Colonel Bradley, the decorated pilot. In her cozy living room, morning light filtered through lace curtains as Margaret carefully opened a small wooden box on her coffee table. Inside lay a Silver Star medal, gleaming softly, and a black and white photograph of a young woman in a 1970s pilot uniform. Herself, over 50 years ago. She picked up the photo, her lined face softening at the sight of the determined smile she once wore. That was the day she completed her first combat mission in Vietnam. Back then, she was one of the Air Force's first female pilots, soaring through skies where few believed a woman belonged. She had fought 2 battles, one in the war and one against the prejudice of her era, and she'd won both at great cost. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she placed the photo back and lifted the silver star. The medal was awarded after she risked her life to guide a damaged aircraft and its crew back to base under heavy enemy fire. Many of her comrades didn't make it home from that war. She closed her eyes, recalling the names of friends etched on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. Perhaps that was why she finally agreed to this trip, a veterans' reunion in Washington, D.C., and a ceremony to honor those who served. For years, she had lived quietly, content to let younger heroes take the spotlight. She never bragged about being a pioneer or a war hero. Most of her neighbors and even distant family had no idea about her past. She preferred it that way. It was easier than facing the pity or disbelief that sometimes came when she did share her story. With a resolute breath, she slipped the medal into a padded pouch and then into the side pocket of her carry-on bag. A small token of the past to keep her company, she thought. Grabbing her late husband's old Air Force cap, the one he gave her for luck, Margaret headed out. A taxi picked her up from her quiet Orlando suburb and whisked her toward the bustling Orlando International Airport. As the car merged into traffic, she gazed out the window. Billboards and palm trees blurred by, but Margaret's mind was far away, lost in memories of roaring jet engines and the feeling of clouds beneath her wings. At the airport terminal, the cacophony of announcements and hurried travelers jolted her back to the present. She navigated the sprawling corridors with careful steps, refusing a courtesy wheelchair offered by a kind attendant. The truth was, her knees ached and her pace was slow, but her pride kept her walking. She managed to find the Delta Airlines check-in desk to drop off her small suitcase, and then joined the security line with just her purse and carry-on. The line inched forward under bright fluorescent lights. Margaret could feel the curious gaze of a teenager behind her, noting her vintage Air Force cap. She offered a polite smile but said nothing. When it was her turn, she dutifully removed her shoes and placed her bag on the conveyor for the X-ray. Stepping through the metal detector, she held her breath like she used to when flying through turbulent skies. And just like turbulence, the machine beeped insistently. A TSA agent pulled her aside. "Is this your bag, ma'am?" the young officer asked, already unzipping it. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She suddenly remembered the medal tucked in the side pocket. Within moments, the officer retrieved the silver star in its pouch, the ribbon peeking out. He looked at it, then at Margaret with surprise. "This came up on the scanner," he said, his tone neutral. Margaret nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. It's a military medal," she explained softly. The agent's eyes flickered with recognition, and perhaps a touch of respect. He called over a supervisor to inspect it. As they examined the medal, Margaret stood by patiently, trying to ignore the impatience of travelers shuffling past her. A few people further back in line craned to see the holdup. She heard someone whisper, "What's going on up there?" She clutched the strap of her purse tightly, ashamed to be causing a scene over something as small as a keepsake. After what felt like an eternity, the TSA supervisor handed back the medal with a courteous nod. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," he said quietly, lowering his voice so others couldn't easily hear. Margaret managed a humble smile and slipped the medal back into her bag. Relief swept over her, though she was now acutely aware of how much time had passed. As she hurried to gather her things, an announcement echoed through the security area. "Final boarding call for Delta Flight 219 to Washington, D.C. Passenger Margaret Bradley. Please proceed to Gate 32 immediately." Hearing her name broadcast so publicly sent a jolt through her. She was late, Ignoring the slight tremor in her knees, Margaret thanked the agents and set off as fast as she could toward her gate. Out of breath, she arrived at gate 32 to find the seating area nearly empty. Everyone else had boarded. The gate agent gave her a tight-lipped smile of relief mixed with mild irritation. "Mrs. Bradley, we're about to close the doors," the agent said as she quickly scanned Margaret's boarding pass. Margaret murmured an apology, her cheeks flushing from more than just the brisk walk. She could feel the remaining few people waiting, including a tall man in a crisp Air Force dress uniform who hadn't boarded yet, eyeing her, this frail, last-minute straggler. Clutching her bag, Margaret shuffled down the jet bridge. Her eyes stung with tears of frustration and self-consciousness. She had tried so hard not to be a burden, yet here she was, delaying a flight. In her mind, she still saw herself as the confident officer who led airmen into battle, but to everyone else today, she must have seemed like just another elderly traveler holding things up. Little did Margaret know, as she neared the airplane door with her head bowed, that fate was about to intervene in a way she never imagined. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged too quickly? Share your thoughts below. Margaret stopped in her tracks at the sound of that firm voice behind her. Her heart, already weary from the morning's trials, skipped a beat. For so long, she had moved through life unseen, her heroic past hidden behind kind eyes and age-worn wrinkles. Decades ago, people spoke her name with reverence. Now, she was almost invisible to the world. But true valor never really fades, and sometimes recognition finds you when you least expect it. If you believe that the sacrifices of our quiet heroes should never be forgotten, please join our journey by subscribing. She turned around slowly on the narrow jet bridge, half expecting another reprimand. In front of her stood the tall man in the Air Force uniform she had noticed earlier. Up close, his medals and insignia glinted under the harsh lighting. He looked to be in his late 40s with steely eyes that now brimmed with emotion. Margaret glanced at the insignia on his shoulders, a silver eagle emblem. A colonel, just like she once was. "Colonel Margaret Bradley?" the officer asked, his voice gentler now but still ringing with respect. Margaret felt a jolt at hearing her name and former rank aloud. It had been years since anyone addressed her that way. She nodded uncertainly, clutching her purse strap. Yes, she managed. Questions raced through her mind. Who was this man? How did he know her name? The gate agent and the flight attendant by the plane's entrance exchanged curious glances, sensing something extraordinary was unfolding. The officer drew a sharp breath, as if reining in strong feelings. "Ma'am, I learned about you in training at the Air Force Academy," he said, his voice reverent and a little awed. "You flew missions in Vietnam. You were a trailblazer, one of the first." He stood even straighter, boots together on the thin carpeting of the jet bridge. "It's an honor to meet you, Colonel." Before Margaret could utter a reply, the officer snapped his heels and brought his right hand up in a flawless salute. His posture was perfect, eyes forward, arm steady as a statue. The narrow passageway fell completely silent. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she realized this salute, crisp, formal, and full of admiration, was meant for her. In that frozen moment, time seemed to stand still on the jet bridge. The young flight attendant's eyes went wide, and the gate agent covered her mouth with a hand, moved by the gravity of the moment. Margaret's mind spun. Was this really happening? She, who had quietly faded into civilian life, was being honored as if no time had passed since her service. Her hand trembled as decades-old instincts kicked in. She straightened her back, shoulders coming up proudly. Tears she'd been holding back all day finally welled in her eyes. As her vision blurred, Margaret managed to raise her own hand to return the salute, slowly and shakily, but with dignity. 2 generations of Air Force pilots held that salute in perfect stillness, one past, one present, right there between the mundane walls of a passenger jet bridge. At that very second, anyone peering down the jet bridge would have witnessed a scene of pure respect and gratitude. And in the back of her mind, Margaret heard the echoes of a distant era, the roar of jet engines, the cheers of her long-gone comrades. Her lips quivered as she mustered a proud, heartfelt smile. Then, as if on cue, the officer dropped his salute and extended his hand to the elderly woman, eyes shining. Mid-air, as her own salute fell, their hands met in a warm, firm grasp. For a moment there was pure, profound silence. Then the stillness broke into a crescendo of clapping. The gate agent and flight attendant started it, their applause quickly joined by the few passengers who witnessed the exchange. The warm sound swelled and carried forward onto the plane. Inside the aircraft's cabin, curious heads turned, and within seconds the clapping spread like a joyful wildfire. Just inside the doorway of the plane, Margaret stood in disbelief as the officer beside her gently placed a supportive hand under her elbow, guiding her forward. She was greeted by a wave of smiling faces. Some passengers had risen from their seats, craning to see the woman who had earned such a salute. A middle-aged businessman, the very one who had huffed about delays earlier, now looked at Margaret with chagrin and awe, his hands coming together in genuine respect. A young mother held her child a little tighter and smiled through tears, realizing they were in the presence of a true hero. As Margaret stepped fully into the cabin, the airline's captain made a rare appearance outside the cockpit. He had heard the commotion and came to add his own salute. Standing at the front of the plane, the captain addressed the passengers, his voice steady over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we take off, I want to acknowledge that we have a very special passenger on board today. This is Colonel Margaret Bradley, one of the first female pilots in the U.S. Air Force and a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. Her bravery and service are an honor to us all." A thunder of applause followed, echoing down the aircraft aisles. Margaret flushed with humility, raising a hand to her heart in gratitude. She never sought the spotlight, and now that it found her, she felt overwhelmed, but also deeply validated. Decades of feeling like a forgotten relic melted away in that flood of appreciation. She glanced at the uniformed officer who had recognized her. He too was clapping, a broad smile lighting up his face. "Ma'am, we would be honored if you join us in the front cabin," the flight attendant said kindly, gesturing toward the first-class seats. For a second, Margaret hesitated, shaking her head modestly. But the captain and the officer exchanged a nod, and the captain insisted, "Please, it's the least we can do." With that, Margaret allowed herself a small nod of acceptance. The officer offered his arm for support, and together they walked her to a plush seat at the front. Passengers parted in the aisle to let them through, still smiling and patting her shoulder as she passed. Settling into the roomy seat, Margaret felt a lump in her throat. The officer stowed her carry-on for her and gave a respectful nod before taking his own seat nearby. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, she gazed out the window at the afternoon sun. Her reflection showed not just an old woman, but a proud veteran, eyes shining with renewed hope. In that journey of mere hours, Margaret experienced a lifetime's worth of recognition. She had boarded anonymously, but she would leave that plane celebrated. The echoes of applause and the warmth of strangers' admiration would remain with her far beyond this flight. And as tears of gratitude slipped down her cheeks, one thought resounded in her heart. Respect has no expiration date. No matter how many years pass or how the world changes, true honor and valor will always be recognized in the end. Margaret's story was living proof that the dignity of one's deeds never fades. It only awaits the right moment to shine again. With renewed faith in the goodness of people The elderly veteran leaned back as the engines roared to life. She wasn't invisible anymore. In the smiles of the passengers and the salute of a fellow officer, she found the acknowledgement she never sought but so deeply deserved. And as the plane lifted into the skies, carrying her once more among the clouds, Margaret closed her eyes and smiled, at peace with the world.